Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. Hi. Thanks for coming. My name is Porter Anderson. Hi, good to see you again. I am the editor-in-chief of Publishing Perspectives. I almost said Punishing Perspectives. That's my nickname for it. Publishing Perspectives, on a good day, is the news medium of Frankfurt Book Fair. And we cover the international trade industry. We are delighted about our participation here in the Literary Translation Center and your participation in the Literary Translation Center. And we are delighted with Amazon Crossing's support and sponsorship of the center for another year, because this is a very important and growing element of the market, particularly in the UK. As you may know, and we mentioned this yesterday if you were around for the session we were doing, that the Nielsen people have discovered a tremendous uptake, and it is continuing. It looks like it's a viable, growing interest in other cultures, and their literature showing up in the UK stats now. So this is very exciting. We want to make this happen and keep happening. This afternoon we have a really interesting program, and I'm excited about this, but it's actually one I asked for and was lucky enough to get for once, because I had discovered such an interesting book, an interesting author behind it, an interesting editor behind it, and for me it's a great representation of the kind of thing that we can look to translated literature to do for us more and more. And that is to bring us the kind of difficult topics that sometimes in our own cultures are something we're not getting to because we're afraid of it, as I think you'll find we are in this case, or we have other withholds about it. This can bring us a reach into issues, trends, factors we need to look at in our society today. I think this one you'll find is quite applicable. So, the book we are talking about, if I can get my hands around it, is called This Life or the Next. This Life or the Next. And it is by the gentleman who's sitting here beside me, Damian Vitanza. The editor is here. This is Elizabeth DeNovo.
Hello.
From Amazon Crossing. And we're going to discuss this and fill you in on the details of this amazing work so that you can see, I think, exactly what I'm talking about. When you catch on to what we're on here about, you will understand just what I meant. First, I want to go to my associates here and have them introduce themselves. Demian, could we start with you? Tell us a little about your work and yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Porter. Hello, everyone. So I'm Damian Norwegian, but with Italian father.
Very Italian name.
Yeah, Damian I chose myself, by the way. Vitanza is that, yeah.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah.
But your first name is Marco.
Marco, yeah.
I found this out. It's on his email.
Some hard sleuthing there.
I guess names is a complicated issue for many writers.
Exactly.
And also, like, where home is. With an Italian father and Norwegian mother, you're kind of confused what is home, and I think that's probably something many people interested in literature feel related to. Looking for home, looking for where to belong, which is what much of my work is about, and also what this book is about. And that has led me to kind of looking for different ways of living, different ways of being, and has made me interested in kinds of otherness and other ways, other life forms. I've been working with refugees in the National Theatre. I've been living in a camper, driving around in Europe in 20 countries, and doing these kind of explorative things. And then also I've been giving writing courses in prison, which is kind of the ultimate homelessness and alienation and confusion. And this is also where this book was born, which we will come back to, I guess. So that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, talk a little about your theater work too.
Yeah, so every time I write a novel, I get sick of being alone, so I want to do something more collective, which is theater, and then I get sick of that, and then I need to pull back and write a novel again. So every second work is kind of back and forth, and my last work is called Wait, was put up in a National Theatre, and kind of also is this looking for belonging as a topic.
Yeah, I think we see a theme running through this, don't we?
Absolutely.
But Damian, isn't your most recent work up for a fairly prestigious prize at the moment?
Yeah, it's nominated for the Ibsen Prize, so I'll know about that next week.
Okay, next week. Okay, well, we'll stay tuned.
It's not yet translated into English, is it?
No.
Hint, hint.
Oh, yeah, I got it.
That's why we look at Ellie next. Ellie, tell us about yourself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Elizabeth Sonoma. I'm senior editor at Amazon Crossing. For those of you who don't know, Amazon Crossing is Amazon Publishing's translation imprint. We're the most prolific producer of translations in English, but the reason that I'm of any interest here today is as Damian's editor. I thought I would just ask, though, while we have your attention, can everybody hear us in the back? Oh, good. Thank you. Can I just get a quick show of hands from you? How many people here are translators? Okay.
Fantastic.
Okay, great. Okay. How many of you are authors? Slightly fewer, but still well represented. Okay, thank you.
How many of you are just readers of translated material?
Wonderful.
Good. Join my club.
You can be more than one.
Right, you can be more than one thing. That's right. Great. Thank you, Ellie. Demian, talk us through the background on this piece so that we understand how it's put together, where it came from, and what it means.
Well, as I said, I've held several writing courses in prison. Find that interesting and fascinating. The encounters, the stories, everything's at stake in prison. You know, so many questions that are asked there every day in all those cells. And on one of these writing courses, I met this guy, a little bit colored skin, Pakistani, but still pale. You know, this was a Norwegian winter, so you don't get too much sunlight. Dark under the eyes. And it came to this day where I walked around and asked everyone, so what's your story about? And and what are you writing about? And what are you writing about? And then I came to this guy, you know, and I remember his page was absolutely blank. This was the 4th day of writing course, and he hadn't written one word. And I asked him, what are you doing here? And he said, well, I have a very important story to tell. Good for you, I said. Why don't you write it? And he said, it's not that easy. There's too much chaos in my mind. I can't put it down to words. I need your help. And that's normally not the kind of things I am used to do as a writer. I have my own things that I want to write about. But I was curious about this guy. There was something about him. And then he said, well, I went to Syria as an Islamist to do jihad. And I understood that this is not normal. It's not common that someone with such a background wants to share his story. So I thought this is important, and then I did do some research, and I figured out that internationally there are very few stories, just some superficial ones, but not really in-depth stories of why people have come on this path leading them to the Syrian...
The radicalization.
Yeah, the radicalization and the Syrian, ending up in the Syrian war.
Exactly.
So I said yes. And then we spent about 150 hours during a year. I was visiting him again and again, sitting in this visitor's room, listening to his story, getting to know him, distrusting him, trusting him, distrusting him again, learning about his life. I remember the first thing he said was, you know, which is also the beginning of the book, by the way, and it is a fiction, but this one remained quite faithful to the truth, which is I don't trust anybody, not even you. And at the end of the session, like after a year, is that now I'm starting to trust you. And this is the journey I would like to share with a reader, that you get to know someone, and maybe you won't trust him, but maybe he learns to open up and trust you as a reader.
It's fantastic. What we're looking at, in fact, is pretty timely right now because, of course, according to who you ask, whether it's Mr. Trump or someone else, the Islamic State is in one condition or another in Syria, and the conflict is at one stage or another, but this is one of the fighters. This is one of these people who went in to do the fighting of ISIS. And what I found fascinating about this, we should say at this point that Tania Thrasher, I always call her Thrasher, is the translator in this case. And there were many challenges that were presented to the translator in a case like this, not least because Demian has used a fascinating device that I found incredibly compelling when I was reading this, in that, I'll put it my way as a journalist would put it, it's as if he was interviewing, as he did, for more than 100 hours, this fighter, and yet you don't hear his questions. You just hear these answers coming across, meaning that at times it's very disarming how a subject will change, a topic will move, a feeling will shift, an emotion will pop up. You don't see it coming because you don't hear the preparation.
But that's one of the things that drew me to the book initially, was that
There you
feeling
go.
of dynamism,
Exactly.
and that feeling of overhearing something. And
Yeah.
it was really engaging just to have that half of the conversation. And then your mind is also working like, oh, what prompted that answer?
Right.
So you're participating in a different way right from the beginning. At least that's what I found.
And if we were in a piece of theater right now to demonstrate this, as soon as Ellie says what she just said to you, I would say something about, ketchup has always been one of my favorite things. And you're sitting there going, where did this come from? Occasionally it's just out of nowhere. And it's striking because normally, as you start to watch what he's doing, it means something quite severe is coming too. So at these moments where you're feeling these shifts come, this, I assume, is where the character he calls Tariq was actually getting close to something he needed to admit, confess, pull out of his psyche that was painful, difficult, horrifying, and he was setting himself up by shifting subjects, like we all do.
Right.
It's a very human and yet dynamic way of communicating this, and I think Tania, I wish we could talk with her too, because it must have been quite challenging at times.
We tried to get her.
Yeah, did we? Good.
Yeah. But she's traveling.
Did she talk about the process for her? Was it?
She did.
Yeah.
And she loves this book. And Tanya and her husband Rashid had spent time in Norway, so they were very attached to the subject of belonging and being outsiders too. And you probably spoke with her about that while she was translating the book. I know the two of you had a lot of contact back and forth. I was looking at your notes that we handed off to the translator before we started, and the things that you thought might be challenging, and one of them was the use or non-use of vulgarity and colloquialisms, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's supposed to be a book that is you read how he speaks.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a monologue or a dialogue where you don't have one part.
Right.
So what makes it sound vernacular or spoken in one language is not the same as in another language. So it just doesn't work with. You have to really play around, and I think it's challenging.
And that's what we had to do, especially with sort of
translate.
curse words or getting that register, because you didn't want it to sound too profane. You wanted to hit exactly the right levels.
Yeah, and especially the thing about cursing. This is a guy who has been deeply into Islam, where cursing is prohibited. But before that, he was a kind of a wannabe gangster, or he was a kind of a gangster.
Thug.
Yeah. So his language is all mixed with this, and then he was meeting a writer, so he tried to kind of get the language that was, and he knew he was, what he would say would create an image of him, kind of, in a book. So all this thing played in and made his language quite high and low. And what is high and low in one language is not necessarily the same as another language.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And Damian told me the most fascinating thing. He would watch this guy go through a bad memory. I'll give you one flash, just one instance. There is a corpse being dragged behind a truck. This is something you see in this kind of warfare. And the guy was trying to deal with this. And he would describe it. He would try to get through it. And Demian felt, as he told me, that he needed to stay strong for the fellow making the confession to him. But then you'd get home and burst into tears when you started crying, when you started writing, because this was so much that you had to hold together on his behalf.
Yeah, I mean, you don't want to stand in the way of his process. It's his process speaking. So you just put yourself in a position of a listener, open up, and make him open up. And support him, and then you go home and you read your notes, and you just think, what's excuse my language, but what the fuck is this?
Yeah.
I mean, is this possible for a human, to do this? And also interesting about that scene was that when he told it the first time. This is the good thing about spending 100 hours, that you get back to things. So the first time he would tell about this story, he would say how that he couldn't eat after he was feeling sick, and he was feeling horrible about this, and he said this is nothing to do with Islam and so on. And then the other day he says, well, actually it felt good. It felt good to see that corpse because it was an Assad soldier. It was a regime soldier.
Yeah.
And he saw the kids throwing stones at them. And he saw the feeling of amongst the general public of satisfaction. So how do you deal with... So that feeling was also there. And that says something about the complexity of these issues. And that you can have many feelings maybe even at the same time, and that is the very issue of. That is why I wanted to write this book in the first place, because there is not one truth. There's not bullet points of reasons why he left. It's not bullet points of what he did and what he felt in Syria. Many try to present themselves as in one way. For instance, when they present themselves in social media, you see these foreign fighters saying, "Oh, everything is great in ISIS," and so on, or they did. And then you see that it's very much more complex than that. Of course it is, because being a human is complex. It's always complex when you dig into it, and that's the complexity that I wanted to get out there, to contrast this black and white discourse that we have in the political discourse, and even in journalism, regarding this topic.
Precisely, and what Demian manages to do is make us understand the delicacy and the complexity, the deepness of what radicalization is. It's never really complete. It's never really full, because this guy started as a perfectly normal fellow, and he ended up a person who would think that he could go out and fight something because he was told to fight something, and his normal self would catch up with him. And suddenly all he's thinking about is socks, and are his feet going to be warm enough? The jihadist is not supposed to worry about his feet, you know? It's a fascinating set of conflicts that you see going on inside this person, and what comes about is the sense of the unreliable narrator that we saw in a prison with In Cold Blood, with Truman Capote. How many of you are aware of that book? It's from what, the 19... when?
That was a wonderful book.
When was that written? It was a fantastic piece, the 60s.
Right? 60s, 70s?
Yeah, incredible case in which Capote apparently really quite fell under the spell of this murderer whom he was interviewing. And that takes us to another point of what Demian was doing with his subject, and that is he had to protect him too. You don't want the forces to find out where this guy now is and still alive, even in prison. Nor do you want him to know about his family, right? You don't want to endanger anybody who's connected to this former fighter, even while he is in jail. So this is why, in fact, I'll ask you to explain this a little bit to them. This is why the character you're seeing is not quite the character that Demian met. Not quite the person.
Well, that was one of the first questions, coming up when starting to speak with him and interviewing him. Like, should we just write this story as one-to-one as possible, as an interview book, even a nonfiction, or what? And it became very soon clear that it was impossible to write the truth, let's say, whatever that means. First of all, because I didn't know what he told, if what he told me was true or not. But that's just one aspect of it. That could even be in a non-fiction. You could have that layer. But then there was also too many things that he couldn't really talk about. For instance, he didn't want to mention a few of his family members, so I decreased a little bit the size of the family. Also, I didn't want to stigmatize people around him. He said he didn't want, the purpose of the book wasn't to make problems for anyone. It was supposed to make problems for you as a reader, but not for his family. His family is torn to pieces anyway, so let's, he didn't want to create any more stress there. So we decided to move the story from his hometown to my hometown, which in fact is just about a few miles. It's like half an hour ride. A very similar town.
Right.
And then I could mix it up with places and people that I knew, but still use the core of the story. So yes, it is fiction, but I like to be honest about where it comes from. Also, I think it's important to tell the story behind, because that's also a valuable story. The story of an encounter. But yeah, it's also a fiction in that sense. It's a fiction in the sense that we don't know if what he says is true or not, and then I've fictionalized it as well. So there are two layers of fiction, if you can follow on that thought. Yeah.
Yeah. And so as I started by saying, one of the reasons I think this is such an important work and a demonstrative work about translated material is because of these massive layers of complexity that come into play in this one work. And these are things that we, in my culture, we couldn't get to. We don't have this character available. We don't see this at this point. We could only have gotten this out of another culture, and here it is, which is, of course, the glory of translation. Ellie, tell us how this book came to you. How did you find this piece? Because it wasn't from the translator, was it?
No, it wasn't from the translator. It was from the agent. So sort of through, it's a story of the triumph of the London Book Fair, or Frankfurt Book Fair, if you will. But Damian's agent, with whom I meet regularly, had their catalog, and I was looking through, and I found this work, and I thought it was transfixing for all the reasons that we've discussed here. And I went back and sat with it. I read the English sample. I got the Norwegian, and luckily was able to read that and go through the whole thing, so I could see that it wasn't an anomalous, like just happened to be a good chapter that they translated. So, and discussed it with the team, and we felt it was such a topical issue, and just as you say, one that wasn't being dealt with in this way. As I've already mentioned, it was the structure was really appealing to me. The structure, the subject matter, and I just felt like it was a wonderful opportunity to bring this author into English, and everyone on the team agreed. There was no hesitation, and so we went for it, and never looked back.
And when will we read his next book from Amazon
You're
Crossing?
going to have to talk to Dave about his next work of fiction. So.
Yeah, we need to make that connection in heaven, I think. No, it's a
But you've been doing drama for the last couple of years since this book came out, correct?
Yeah.
No, it's a fascinating story that I think does come across in such a unique way that it's important that we get the word out about it, and it's also important that we get the word out about it as, again, a reason why translation is bringing us things we're not going to get otherwise. This is the kind of work that I think in many cases a translator does put forward.
That's true.
The kind of piece that I could see a translator advocating. I was in another session earlier today, and once again, as we said in our session yesterday, translators become the best advocates for various books.
Well, that's really true. And so I should use the opportunity to plug our translation submission website, where any translator can go and submit works that they find as compelling as we found this one.
And in how many languages now?
Is it 12? 14? 14 languages.
It's just incredible. Yeah, one of the nice things that Amazon Crossing is doing in many cases is it's not all just English and back and English and back. It's into other languages as well. There's a great multiplicity occurring there, which is exciting too, and needs to happen. But the conversation we were having about translators as advocates for works earlier today also included the fact that many of you who work in translation will know a house better than others might too. So you'll not only find a good book that you think you want to put forward for translation, but you'll know the right publisher. You'll know how to approach that publisher, what they're looking for, what they need. I think that the more translators who work with Ellie, the better they are at knowing what you're looking for and what you respond to. Yeah. Because she brings in the most amazing books.
Thank you so much.
It's astonishing. Yeah, it's great. I'm a big fan, and I think that we look at Amazon in many ways that aren't kind at times in the publishing industry, as you know. This is something that's just fantastic. This is an element of Amazon that needs to be seen, recognized, and appreciated, because one of the greatest parts of being an author and being a translator working with Amazon Crossing is they can sell it. They know how to sell, and this is fantastic because it means work gets out there.
It is really nice to see writers connect with their readership in English. It's very rewarding for all concerned.
Yeah. I'd like to ask if we have questions in the house or comments that you would like to make relative to like what we're talking about. Great. I think we'll have a mic come to you. Hang on a moment. You and I met yesterday. It's good to see you again. Can you say, sorry, right to your right. Hold your hand up. There you go. Gotcha. Thank you.
It's a question for Damian.
Good.
Sorry, did I say that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm also an author, and I look at issues of identity, and I'm very, very curious what insights you got from your 100 so hours of interviewing. I need to put it into a bit of context. I've also been thinking about the draw of, a radicalization process, because my own spouse has been become, gone from agnostic to very religious very quickly. And if it had been Islam, I suspect she might well have gone to Syria. It's that sort of process. And I wonder whether, and the first thing you said was, don't trust anybody. That was the attitude, right? And she's very similar. And I wonder what insights you had when talking to this person. What makes one person turn to that and other people don't? Because, bad things happen to all of us. It's how we respond, right, that makes the difference. So was there anything, and I appreciate it's complicated, there won't be one answer, but was there anything that you thought, this is what drew this person in? Whereas with somebody else, it would be something different. A different response, in other words.
Well, thanks for your question.
Good question.
It is, and unlike journalism and research, that I said, tried to find kind of bullet points to say reasons why he left. I think I looked for it also in the way he speaks, also in the way he disagrees with himself, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted it to be spoken, so that you can follow the way he speaks as a kind of thought process. And then you do have the bullet points. You do have that his father was in prison while he grew up. You do have that he was a Pakistani in Norway feeling racism and all. You have all these kinds of things, but you can have that with many people also that don't leave to Syria. So I usually say that it's a bit like, I don't know if you remember from school, what makes fire. Is like you need something combustible, some material, you need oxygen, and you need ignition, right? So I like to say that it's like the combustible material is his social background, his psychological background, his father being in prison, feeling excluded from society, and all these kind of aspects, socio-economical aspects. Then you have the oxygen, which is the ideology, spreading, internet a lot, cookies. He talked a lot about cookies, so tracing you, and then you start walking a little bit on one path, researching, what is jihad, just to know, and then it takes you on a path, and you go deeper and deeper into a very hardcore Salafi YouTube videos and then lectures, and you get more and more into that. And then you have the last part, which is the ignition, and that is the Syrian war. In Norway, 75% of the people that left for Syria were radicalized after the Syrian war started. So this global aspect, this is really the spark. You see what's happening on the news. You shouldn't underestimate the power of those images and seeing injustice and wanting to do something about it, which, to be honest, in one way is a healthy impulse. But then, of course, the question is, where do you take it? What do you do about this impulse? Wanting to do something. So I think it's many reasons leading up to this. And some people like to talk about the ladder of radicalization. It's like one step at a time, and I don't really believe in that, because there's a reason why you do take the next step. So it's more chemistry than arithmetics, if that makes sense. And yeah, just going back to where I started, it's found just as much in the language, the way he speaks, the way his thoughts flow, as it is in kind of bullet points, explanations. Yeah. He's also a very curious man. You need to be curious to end up, and you need to be one that cross borders in many ways.
Mm-hmm. And courageous, honestly, right?
Yeah, in one way. I usually say that in prison there are a lot of courageous people. They just use their courage in a very stupid way. Yeah. And people get provoked when I use courage in that sense, because it's a kind of, we like to think of courage as only positive, but I would say it's in a way it's courageous, and very stupid, of course.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and that, of course, in our current political climate is why I sometimes refer to this as a rather dangerous book, because there are a lot of people who would like not to see a young man of this kind be seen in any sympathetic light whatsoever. But this is a real person, and there are real vulnerabilities here. And when you read the book, you start thinking about moments in your life, particularly when you were young and you were able to be turned and attracted to something. And you know the ferocity of youth when you find something new and you become so completely engrossed with it. And
right.
I can see this.
And this person could have come from, this could be someone from Detroit. This could be someone from Norway. This could be someone from the UK.
Yeah. Which is another part of it that many of our political friends do not want us to say. You know, they want to act as if a radicalized kid is just a monster that would never appear in our home. This guy could be sitting right next to me. Yeah.
Or me.
Or you. It's pretty bizarre. Yes, please. Here comes the microphone. Thanks.
Hello, my name's Anissa, and I'm a translator. I translate from French. I'm curious about something that Porter said. You said that you felt this was a book that could only come to us as a translated work from another language because it simply wouldn't be available in our culture. I think those were your words. Obviously I'm a translator. I'm all for all kinds of works from all over the world to be translated and brought into English. But I'm wondering, what I'm thinking is there are a number of authors who write in English who are themselves of Pakistani or Indian background, Islamic backgrounds, who have fictionalized the radicalization that characters being radicalized. I'm thinking of Mohsin Hamid and The Reluctant Fundamentalist. I'm thinking of Kamala Shamsi and Home Fires. And I'm thinking of Nadim Aslam, who's written a number of wonderful books that are very intense, and they're fictional accounts of young Muslims being radicalized.
Right.
So, perhaps you could tell us how this book is different. Obviously it is based on one particular journey, but I was just curious where that came from. Why
it's not out of any disrespect. It's certainly to Kamala's work. She's wonderful. Yeah. But to anybody who's working in this field and in this issue, I think more power to them. The reason I found that this was so compelling to me, I think, is not least because of the multiplicity of cultures here. I would not have expected to find this in a book coming out of Norway. There we are sitting with a Norwegian Pakistani who is the character we know as Tariq in the book. It comes to me as an American, which is of course different from the way it's coming to you, from a distance that gives me maybe a little more safety in dealing with it, because it didn't begin as an English work. And as a journalist, I think it probably comes to me a little more easily because it comes from a real story. I like the veracity, whereas normally I'm a great fiction reader, and I generally read literary myself. But I found that in this case, I was helped by the fact that I knew that this had come from actual interview. Now these are random responses of my own, though, and they may not be at all yours, right? Yeah. So it's a pretty subjective comment for me.
For you, was it a journey of discovery of what it means to be, a person of Pakistani Islamic heritage growing up in a Western country like Norway? Was that part of it for you as you were learning about this character's life?
I think that he was Pakistani, or if he had been had an other background, was not the core. It was more the questions he was forced to ask and did dwell upon, and that I forced him to dwell upon. So it's always what's at stake, and it's always to create problems for the reader in mind. Yeah.
I'm looking forward to reading it. It sounds wonderful. So.
I love it.
But I have a completely different background, of course, but still, being Norwegian Italian, we did talk a lot about this thing of being in between cultures, which I could relate to. I find very interesting, and I think that's an interesting way to approach. We're so used to look at what's different, like, oh, you're from over there. Okay, tell me about over there. But when you have this distance, an Islamist, having been in Syria, who said he enjoyed looking at the corpse being dragged behind the truck. you have to start with the things you have in common. So also for completely different reasons, my father was a lot away because he worked a lot. Okay, so we found something in common there about this. So I think that's a little bit what's in it for me. But I'm also a person like most writers, most people interested in literature, I guess all of you, who don't accept easy answers. And that's really, I think, the most important point for me in this book is just not accepting the easy answers and wanting to do it the hard way. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. There's a question over here. We'll get to you in a moment. Thank you. Yep, go right ahead. That's fine, thanks.
Hi. Suppose kind of building on the last question you had, it was more about the process and whether, like, was it a common...
Just 1 second.
Yeah.
Can I ask the sound? We don't have a monitor here, so can I ask a little bit more sound when they are asking questions? And closer to the mouth, you said.
Sorry.
Good idea.
My question was more about the process and between meeting this person and then deciding to spend all that time with them and develop this sort of close relationship and then make it into a book with your name on it. Did you ever have any second thoughts about that, and how did you address that?
Super problematic.
It's a great question.
It is a story of fiction. Starting from he didn't want to have his name on it. Okay, so that's it's not something I didn't want to steal his story, and he didn't want his story. But he said, so we agreed upon that. And also there is a work of literature. I mean, my greatest concern, as I already said, is to create problems for you guys. So as a reader, and I want the problems that you are facing to be similar to the problems I was facing when I sat there together with him, developing this friendship. And then the way you create those same problems for the reader are not necessarily just writing what he tells you. So sometimes you have to go another, because I got a sympathy with him. For instance, he would ask me a lot of questions about how I was feeling. He was showing a lot of empathy towards me. He was, I see him as a warm person, caring, and I couldn't really put that into this book. So I had to find other ways to give a similar feeling. So in a way, this is a bit daring to say, but I would say that sometimes fiction can be, I needed the fiction to be more true to the process that I was in, to share that process with you. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Fascinating. I think you had a question here. Microphone is coming.
Hi. I wanted to ask, at what point do you think that this man was de-radicalized, and what does de-radicalization look like to you personally? And did these very human conversations, did they help in that process?
Thanks for that question. I think one of the things I find very fascinating, and this is why I also share the story about the book. I like to share the story about the book because there are some aspects that are not in the book, but they even came after the book. And when I met him, he was dealing with a lot of post-traumatic stress. He was very confused. He he had a lot of nightmares. He felt a lot of guilt for not complying to certain extreme standards or understandings of Islam. So I would say he had started the process of de-radicalization, but he was very psychologically distressed. And that's something we don't take into account enough, that people that come, they have seen the worst. So you cannot just de-radicalize without starting with a process of getting a healthy mental space. The writing process, the having the space to tell your story. He said it was like putting things back into the right drawer, and then he could move on a little bit. But of course, it's not a linear process. De-radicalization is not a linear process, and he can have fallback. I cannot guarantee that he's completely de-radicalized, but I would say so. The way I meet him today is more and more looking at other aspects of life, trying to keep a healthy relation to Islam without cutting it. Now, lately I can share with you, he said last time I met him, it was like, I stopped praying now. In one way I feel guilty, but I feel God still loves me. And I was like, wow, that's nice. In a way, not feeling this obligation, this shame, this compulsion, but trying to find a healthy relationship with Allah. It's a long process that many individuals have to go through, and I have to mention, not all do go through that process. He is the guy who wanted to share his story. Then you have many people who are just staying in this repetition, this loop of unhealthy, compulsive thinking, ideologically cracked down. So that can also be a story. But his story is it's a rather healthy one, of moving 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and then slowly getting there as a member of society again in Norway. Now he's soon out of prison.
Right. I think I see a question here. Thank you for that.
Hi. I'm just wondering, was he, maybe I missed something at the beginning, was he belonging to a group of terrorists before he became open to talk to you? Or was he involved in killing or something as such, like the fundamentalists do?
So he had been in Syria. He went to Syria without knowing exactly which group he would go to, and this is proven by evidence in court that I also looked into. He was doubting whether he should go into something called, sorry, my Arabic is not good, but I think Jaish al-Mujarin wal-Ansar, or ISIS. ISIS had just been established. It was not the caliphate yet. This was 2013. So he was he had heard about ISIS. All this thing about decapitation and all this was not really that known. He had a feeling they were following what he called true Islam, and also this other group was. So he was a bit confused. Now, there's 3 parts of the book, or actually 2, and then there's kind of an epilogue. And the second part, which is when he enters the border to Syria, he says, the character says, which is also, I can share with you, that's also something from truth, from now on you won't know exactly what is true and not. So it's kind of a self-announced, unreliable narrator, right?
Exactly.
So, and still, just because fiction is so compelling, we want to believe him, right? But he has said that, so we have to bear that in mind. He said he visited ISIS. He said he had something to do with them, but very little. And then he went to kind of other groups, and then he kind of was independent, and he was very confused with which group he should be. And this is something we have evidence about also, that he was not sure which group he was in. And he had one friend going and dying for one group, and one other friend who went to another group that is not terror listed, So that's, and when you're there on the ground, you have no clue about these things. Probably he might, I suspect he might have had a little bit more to do with ISIS. Maybe he was more drawn towards that than he shares, than the story guy in the book tells. But this is also something that you are invited to doubt. And I try to put some snares for the reader, like reminding, like almost like this Brechtian Verfremdungseffect, V-effect, kind of telling, like this red light, look out, this might not be true. Kind of reminding, I think 2 or 3 times during the story, this might not be exactly how it happened. But I think the inner process of doubting where to go, doubting what is right and wrong, the confusion is absolutely the human process that he went through, and that is also very valuable. And that's why I also wanted to include that part of Syria, although we don't know exactly how true it is. And maybe I know a little bit more than the reader of what is true and not, but also I don't know exactly if there's something he couldn't say because maybe he would endanger other people or put other people into trouble or even get a harder sentence himself. Yeah.
But from that perspective, regardless of which faction he was more drawn to, his presence in Syria was legally problematic Right.
Oh yeah, and at least ethically, you know. So you know, just the involvement, just going down there and putting another Kalashnikov in the Syrian war is not exactly the solution, right?
Exactly.
Or I don't know, at least not in the way I look at it. But legally, there are terror-listed groups and not terror-listed groups. And if he had gone to a non-terror-listed group, it would be legally okay.
Okay.
Just like a lot of Kurdish people have gone down and fighting on the Kurdish side. On their holidays and so on, and that's illegal according to Norwegian law. So, yeah.
All right. That's a good clarification.
Fascinating. Tell us, Elizabeth, when you're hearing first about a piece that may be interesting to you, what is it normally that grabs your interest the most as an editor?
Boy, that is a great question, and it is as varied an answer as the works themselves, honestly. I know it sounds like a cop-out, but it's not, because in one book it could be this great structural device, and in another it could be these compelling characters or in another it could be the way that it's plotted. Right. You know, if it's genre fiction, and we do genre fiction and also literary fiction and now narrative nonfiction. So there are hundreds of ways to fall in love with a book.
That's a nice way to put it. And that's a nice place to end, actually. We're very close. If there is another question, we're happy to take it. Otherwise, I think we're pretty close to the end of our time here. And thank you for coming. It's been great to have you, for your interest. Demian, thank you so much.
Thank you, Porter.
We're supposed to remind you that there are books. This book that we've been discussing is right there, available for you right now.
Right back
For free. Thank you very much for coming today.
Thanks
for coming, everyone.
Thanks, Damian.
Thanks, Damian.